Welcome to today's webinar on application security, the 5 best practices for slashing enterprise risk. Thank you for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedules. Today's webinar is brought to you by Security Innovation. Security Innovation is a leader in software security with over 1/3 of the Fortune 100 relying on Security Innovation's assessment and training solutions to protect their brands. My name is Holger Schulze. I am the founder and CEO of Cybersecurity Insiders, the 400,000 member online community for cybersecurity professionals. And I'll be your moderator today. Now it is my pleasure to welcome our featured presenter, Ed Adams. Ed is a software quality and security expert with over 20 years of experience in the field. He served as a member of the Security Innovation Board of Directors since its inception in 2002 and took over as CEO in 2003. Welcome, Ed. Thank you for presenting today.
Thank you, Holger. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. All right, let's start with taking a quick look at today's agenda. First, we will review a few of the key findings of the recent application security report produced by Cybersecurity Insiders and Security Innovation. And after reviewing, the state of application security, Ed will dive deeper into the 5 best practices for, slashing risk, including threat modeling, risk rating of applications, training, and more. Now, the application security survey I mentioned was conducted earlier in 2018 and collected responses from over 400 cybersecurity professionals, basically taking their pulse, right, regarding application security to reveal the latest trends, right, organizations' priorities and technology preferences. And as you can see, the results are coming from a representative sample and representative mix of organizations, industries, right, across company sizes and different IT security job roles. Now, let's dive into some of those key findings. In a nutshell, the survey confirmed that the majority of organizations still, rely on penetration testing and testing applications early in the development lifecycle. Most of these organizations manage application security themselves, right? And they're moderately confident in their application security posture. But a majority is still falling short of the necessary, policies and controls, right, required to defend against security threats. The biggest barrier to reducing risk is still a shortage of skilled security staff and a lack of, security awareness among employees. On this note, Ed, let me ask you, does this align with what you're seeing in the market?
It most certainly does, Holger. As we'll see later on in the presentation, about 50% of the respondents to the survey indicated that they don't have enough staff, and it's been that way for a number of years. And frankly, I don't see it improving anytime in the near future, and that's partly why these best practices for slashing enterprise risk focused on application security is all about efficiency, because everyone has to do more with less these days.
That's exactly right. Moving on, when it comes to the maturity level of application security strategies, many organizations in our survey still have a long way to go. Nearly 1/3 of organizations here on the right side of the chart are doing little to nothing for application security. Only 7% of respondents said that their organization is on the cutting edge of application security, while only 26% characterize their company as being mature. Ed, any surprises here from your perspective?
I'm really surprised that more than 1/4 are just touching the surface or doing nothing, even still. Having been in this industry now for over 15 years, I like to think that nothing surprises me anymore, but that one really did jump out at me. A quarter of organizations, doing basically bare minimum or nothing.
Exactly, that is a scary surprise. Moving on, the good news is that organizations are realizing software is a big risk, right? It can be a risk to an organization. And one of the indicators showing that organizations are taking application security a little bit more seriously is the increasing willingness to put resources behind application security. As we can see here on the chart, the 50% slice of organizations that plan to increase their budgets, right, for application security, that's one of the highest rates we have seen in a while across virtually all security domains, right? And almost a quarter here says that their budgets will grow by more than 20%, right? That's a significant number. The next challenge, obviously, is where to spend the additional funds, right? Is it going to be people, right? Is it process or technology? And the question is, where will organizations see the biggest return, right? Ed, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, as a security vendor, I'm thrilled to see that half of the respondents plan to increase their security budget next year, and then 25% of those by more than 20%, which is great. So I'm very happy about it. At the same time, I'm not surprised at this, and partly because we've had so many horrific data breaches and cybersecurity problems, especially over the last few years. Whether it's credit unions or large retailers, everyone seems to be getting hit on a regular basis. And again, as a security vendor, I feel a bit guilty about that, because it's sort of like the weatherman that's hoping for a tornado or a hurricane because it's interesting for them. Just like cybersecurity spend going up means that there are some real problems in the world, and although it's good for security vendors who will reap some of the benefit, it means that there's a lot of attacks that are being successful.
All right, that sounds good. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about some of the other key findings? Then I'm curious to learn about the 5 best practices.
Absolutely, but let's start with a little bit about me. You're weatherman here. I am a CEO like yourself, Holger, by day. However, my training and a lot of my heart is still in the engineering world. I was trained as a mechanical engineer, spent time as that and a software engineer. You can see at the bottom of the slide here some of the work that I'd done previously, building non-lethal weapon systems. I am a privacy by design ambassador for the great country of Canada, and also a research fellow at the Ponemon Institute. Part of the reason that I like to mention that I'm an engineer by trade is because when I went from the mechanical engineering world into the software engineering world, I really thought people had just lost their minds, because there was really no concept of security at all. In fact, even quality was sort of a dirty word. And in the mechanical engineering world, safety, which is the analog to security in that world, it was just part of your job, and it was expected. As you're designing, as you're defining requirements, as you're building and then testing, safety was a factor at every single step of the way, and it just hasn't been the case in software for a very long time. So moving on, the agenda. I'm going to talk about these 5 best practices as we move on, but here are the answers to the test, if you will. These are the 5 that we'll be talking about: threat modeling, attack surface reduction, risk rating applications, and then training and creating a secure, repeatable software development lifecycle. And what I plan on doing is referencing some of this great research that your organization did, Holger, along the way, just to kind of really make a point as we're moving through and talking about these 5 best practices. And the first that we're going to start with is threat modeling. Now, there's this image on the screen. It's actually something called a Headington shark out of the UK. Believe it or not, it's art. Not my particular style of art, but it's art. The reason that I like to use this is, if there happened to be a giant shark that plunged into the roof of your house, would you have to do threat model for that? Typically, no, you don't have to threat model for that at all. But you certainly wouldn't have to do it if you lived 100 miles from the ocean. would be extraordinarily uncommon for this to happen anywhere, but if you're 100 miles from the ocean, even more so. And the point here is that you can't threat model everything. You can't protect against all risks. So doing so with some context in mind, for example, if you live in Iowa in the US, you don't typically have to deal with any type of ocean threat. And if you do, then we have some real serious problems. So one of the data points that cybersecurity insiders surfaced here is that a rush to release, which is a pressure that all software development teams feel, is a direct cause of programmers neglecting secure coding practices. And that's really unfortunate, but again, not completely surprising. Time to release is really the one thing that development teams are measured on more than anything else. Here's a set of features, get them out the door by this date, come hell or high water. So almost half of the respondents said that that is causing a neglect to the secure coding practices. And that's not going away anytime soon. So what you need is a plan, and you need a realistic plan, because you also can't test extraordinarily deeply every single time. And that's what threat modeling is all about. Another data point from your survey is, the question was, what are your biggest concerns when it comes to cybersecurity? And as you can see, there were 7 different answers that 25% or more of the respondents said were amongst the biggest concerns. Basically, that's pretty much everything. Protecting data, securing applications that you develop, securing mobile applications, malware, cloud applications, threat detection. It's all important. And that, again, not surprising, but everyone has limited staff and limited budget. So even though you might be worried or concerned about many different attack vectors, you have to be very prudent with your spending, and that goes in terms of both time and money. So how do you stay focused? And the answer, to me, is threat modeling. Threat modeling is a very simple type of activity that you can do. You can do it on a whiteboard, you can do it in your head, you can do it with a threat modeling tool for software applications that Microsoft provides. It's free, by the way, you can download it from their website. But basically, all threat modeling is identifying your key assets, determining how they might be compromised, and then building appropriate defenses to protect those assets. And most people do this every single day and just don't realize that they're doing it subconsciously. For example, when you leave your house, some people lock the door, and some people don't. Why would you lock your door? Well, to prevent someone from getting in. Or as someone recently told me at a trade show when I was making a presentation, they lock their doors to keep their teenagers from getting out. But similarly, folks will have an alarm system. Some people have an alarm system. Some people don't, because they live in a safer neighborhood, or they're not worried about intrusions. But even those that do have an alarm system on their house, most only put it on the first floor windows and doors, and not a second floor if your house has a second floor. They do that because it's much easier to break into a first floor window or door. It's much more difficult to do it from a second floor because you need a ladder, you're much more visible, etc. So folks accept that threat and don't put a mitigating control in place for it. That's threat modeling. And doing the same thing with software is just as easy, believe it or not. The one thing to keep in mind when threat modeling is that threats are not vulnerabilities. Threats are persistent. They are essentially attack vectors. Yes. Someone that could break into my house is a threat. That's not going away, never. A vulnerability might be an unlocked door. If I lock my door, that's a mitigating control against that threat. So threats are not vulnerabilities. In conducting threat modeling is especially effective when you do it early on in the life cycle. Even if it's very simple things like someone might guess my password. Well, what do I do to try to mitigate that threat? I create a strong password, or I use a password manager, or I encrypt or hide my password. Again, that's threat modeling that most people do on an everyday basis, and doing it for software is just as easy. These are characteristics of the high-performance application security organization, and colored very simply in red, yellow, and green. Red is and by the way, these are organizations that actually practice some type of application security controls or testing. Less than 25%, by the way, said that they do threat model, which again is a shame because it's a very high leverage activity that you don't need to spend a lot of time or money on, and it returns the highest bang for the buck, if you will. So the red, organizations that use a vendor scoring method. Now, vendor scoring methods are fine. They can at least give you a relative measure, either between one scan and the next, or across multiple applications. However, they have no context of your environment, of your risk, of your requirements, and they can't because they're just scanning products, and that's all that scanners do is just scan. So that's a lower maturity level from the high performance organization. The next level up in maturity are those that use industry standard scoring systems like CVSS. And then finally, the most mature or high performance application security organization are those that are using contextual risk strategies when it comes to application security. And those 22% of respondents that indicate that they threat model, most of them are going to end up falling in this high maturity, high performance area of contextual risk. Next, reducing your attack surface. And this very much goes hand in hand with threat modeling. It's difficult for you to threat model unless you understand how you can be attacked. And again, referring to the research report that was conducted earlier this year, 41% of us say that we have less than 10 people on our security staff. Application security and penetration testing combined, which is a pretty low number. But then when you look at 22% have zero, that's just even more frightening. So, Holger, at the beginning of this presentation, you showed some of the demographics, and there were actually some quite large companies that were part of the survey. Yet, we've got only 10% of the respondents had more than 25 employees that were dedicated to application security and penetration testing. So, limited staff is always a problem. So, you have to do more with less, in lower risk without just throwing bodies at the problem because you can't find those bodies in the first place. All right, another data point from the survey. Which attacks have you experienced in the last 12 months? And again, there were 7 different attacks that rated higher than 15% in terms of the respondents that said they experienced it. Almost a third had some kind of malware attack. About 25% had either some kind of misconfiguration that was exploited or distributed denial of service attack, etc. And those 21% that reported they had no attacks, I put them squarely in the camp of they don't realize that they have been attacked. I guarantee all 21 of those organizations, all 21% of those organizations have experienced some attack, and they just don't know it. So the question is, how do you build more self-defending applications? And I'm going to refer back to a concept of minimalization. The bigger the attack surface is, creates the biggest security problems. And just using the analogy of this castle here, if you look at all the different elements of the castle, all of the different components of it, you can see a number of different ways where this castle could be attacked. It could be walking through the front door, it could be going through a window, it could be scaling a wall. And then there's a whole bunch of others as well, like digging out the ground from underneath one of the side of the castle, which is ultimately how most castles ended up getting destroyed. The point here is you need to enumerate your attack points to get a good picture of your overall attack surface. And when that comes to software applications, you have to look at things like user interfaces. With the castle, the user interface is the front door, it's a window. But you also have to look at all of the different input fields. What are you using for web services and APIs? What type of database access are you providing? Is it encrypted? Is it not encrypted? Are you sending credentials in clear text? All that sort of stuff. And the entire collection of all of those potential attack points is your attack surface. And the fewer entry points, the better. A lot of times with software applications, there are features that are either turned on or enabled that don't need to be, or there are features that are enabled for certain roles in an application that don't need those types of privileges. So the concept of least privilege and the concept of minimalization when it comes to application security features and attack points is the best way to reduce your attack surface. And it's also a very effective way to protect against vulnerabilities. For those of you that are familiar with the attacks that happened a number of years ago, it was 2014 actually, it was 4 years ago, 14 and 15, there was a group of hackers that attacked a few financial services organizations, very well-known financial services organizations, and they were able to extract millions of data records and steal hundreds of millions of dollars at the end of the day. The group was recently indicted, and their leader, which was called Shalon, S-H-A-L-O-N. The group, all of the attacks, 100% of the attacks that they used in 2014 and 2015 took advantage of known and unpatched security vulnerabilities. So all of them were exploits of known and unpatched security vulnerabilities. That is the definition of leaving yourself vulnerable because you haven't done an attack surface enumeration. And as soon as you do an attack surface enumeration, one of the first things that is going to become evident is, are all of my software elements up to date? Are they patched? And if the answer is no, then you immediately have a potential problem. And by the way, don't forget about software that you don't own. It used to be the good old days, I'm reminiscing here, when organizations developed software, they actually wrote their own code. That is far from the truth today. There are loads and loads of open source libraries that are copied and pasted. You're dependent on many third parties for software, whether it's SaaS software, it's database software, supply chain software, ERP software, and much of that you don't control in terms of the code level. So you have to understand what security vulnerabilities and what threats you might be inheriting when you're using those software applications. And you have to consider them as part of your attack surface and take the same approach of least privileged and minimalization. And for those of you that remember the Target data breach a number of years ago, you may or may not realize that it was actually a third-party software that was the initial entry point, and it was the main way that the attackers got onto the Target network. It was actually an HVAC, an air conditioning and heating and ventilation software from an Italian vendor, and again, very easily scanned to determine what are the default usernames and passwords that ship with that software. And one of the problems, or one of the mistakes that Target made, is they left that software not only publicly available, but with its default admin username and password, and that's a no-no. That's an easily solved attack point or attack vector, but a lot of times folks don't think about third-party software as putting you at risk. And in Target's case, it was the target brand that got damaged. It was the target customers' data that got stolen. They're the ones that took the hit for it. Their CEO lost, and the CIO and the CISO all lost their jobs. So third-party software is also a huge attack vector, and you need to be careful of it. Now, unfortunately, as you can see here, only 41% of respondents identify and test all third-party software. 27% have a policy but don't enforce it, and then the rest don't even have a policy for third-party software or don't know. And if they don't know, most likely they don't have a policy for it. All right, so we've talked about identifying and reducing your attack surface, and we've talked about threat modeling. Next, I want to talk about risk rating applications. And again, it goes hand in hand with not enough time, not enough money. Here's an example of a security investment made in the wrong place. Why put a bar and a gate down on front of a driveway when there's nothing else around it and people can just drive right around the gate? This is an image I've been using for years. Just to me, it says it all. Why spend the money and put that security control in place when it's not going to do you any good? Another data point from the survey. The question here is, which types of applications present the highest security risk to your business? And once again, pulling a number of different types of applications, whether it's customer facing, it's legacy, it's mobile, it's desktop, it's ERP systems, or even internal applications. There were 6 different types of applications that at least 23% of respondents said is creating the highest risk. So you can see it's pretty well distributed. And part of the reason for this, by the way, is that software is running our world these days. It doesn't matter if it's a mobile application or if it's an IoT device or it's software as a service. Software is the weakest point in any of our technology systems, and it is running all of those things, even the hardware. I'm speaking to you right now over a voice over IP phone. It's completely software controlled. Another data point. This one, again, quite disturbing. But when asked, how confident are you that you know all of the applications that exist in your organization? Only about 10% said that they're very confident. 20% were not confident at all. And in fact, more than half were either not confident at all or just somewhat confident. And this is the case of shadow IT. It's remarkable how many organizations do not know and cannot enumerate the number of applications that are live on their network. I happened to be at an organization just last week in San Francisco in the States, and they actually showed me exactly how many applications they have, and they even broke it down by type of application. We have this many mobile applications, this many IoT or embedded applications, this many web applications, and I was very impressed because that's not something I'd seen in many, many years. What you see here on the left-hand side is pretty common. Most organizations don't know how many applications they have. And then when you look at how many applications at any given organization, there are a lot, a lot of applications. 2/3 of organizations in this survey have either over 100 applications that are live, or they don't know. And look at 26% have over 500 applications. That's a lot of software to secure, and it's a lot of software to figure out how to test. So if you're one of these organizations that have over 100 applications, and again, it's very, very common, as you can see from the data, how do you figure out which ones to test, when to test them, how frequently to test them, and how deep you test them? And that's what application risk rating is all about. All applications are not created equal. And given the fact that most organizations have hundreds of software applications that they need to secure, and they have the constraint of limited staff, limited time, and limited budget, you have to create a framework that allows you to calibrate the depth and the frequency of testing according to the risk or the criticality of the application. What this allows you to do is to make more informed and more intelligent decisions. Now, what I've seen, unfortunately, all too common, is an organization might invest in, say, again, a scanning tool. And I'm not knocking the scanning vendors. They're fantastic. We use scanning solutions at Security Innovation as well, but just understand their place, understand their limitation, understand their strengths. What I've seen at too many organizations is that they'll invest in a scanning tool or service, and they will just apply the scan to all applications. So they have 150 applications, they're just going to run the same scan on all 150 applications. And they think that they're covered, and they think that they're getting the same level of testing and the same depth of testing. And frankly, that's a pretty foolish approach to take. I understand why organizations take it, because they need to do something. It's pretty easy to just take a single approach for all of your applications. But what you're doing is, you're probably spending money in places where you don't have to, which is a shame. But more importantly, you're most likely not doing enough testing on mission critical applications. So if you look at just 3 simple tiers, tier 1 is mission critical, tier 3 is non-critical, and then tier 2 is just something in between. And I've provided a couple of examples here. Mission critical application would be something that handles sensitive data, highly sensitive data. There might be a lot of customer or regulatory requirements, and there's you need deep analysis, because if that application goes down, it's going to cause a lot of pain for you, and you don't want to experience that pain. And to me, I just think of Amazon.com. Well, what happens if Amazon.com goes down? They lose a lot of money. Their customers get very frustrated. That would be a bad thing. And that did happen. If folks remember, a couple of years ago, the distributed denial of service attack on Dyn, D-Y-N, it took out about 1/3 of the internet for a couple of days, and people were freaking out. Again, software vulnerability was at the genesis of that attack. Attackers took over and exploited millions of unsecured IoT devices like IP-enabled cameras and digital video recorders, and used them to flood the Dyn servers with traffic. And because Dyn's business was routing DNS, or domain name servers, essentially translating Amazon.com into the IP address that it actually goes to Amazon.com, their entire business fell apart, and as a result, about 1/3 of the internet went black for a couple of days. Next level down, tier 2, a semi-critical application. It might have some sensitive data. There might be some compliance or legal requirements, but what you're looking for there is a cost-quality balance. Those mission-critical applications, you want to make sure you get really broad and deep coverage with it, because if it goes down or it gets attacked, it's big problems. There's less problems in semi-critical. And then a non-critical application, the example I gave here is a 30-day cashback website. Let's say I'm Best Buy or Sony, and for 30 days I'm going to put up a website, allow you to put in information if you bought a pair of speakers from Best Buy, and for the next 30 days you put in some information online, and we'll send you a check for $20. That's a non-critical application. Doesn't really have any sensitive data, short lifespan, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as you go from non-critical to critical, the ability to automate becomes more difficult. However, the sensitivity and the criticality of the application increases. The point here is that all applications are not created equal. So if you're just doing a simple web scan on all tier 3 applications, that's great, but you can't apply that same strategy to a mission critical application and expect that you're going to get completely covered. Here's an example of security testing depth and frequency It's just a simple chart that was created, again, using just 3 simple tiers, high, medium, low, or critical, high, low, whatever it is. And the first table up there, I just listed a few different characteristics. Is the data, how sensitive is it? Is it public? Is it private? Or is it restricted? What's the lifespan of the organization? What about regulatory, legal, and customer and compliance requirements? Is it customer facing or not, etc. And you can just apply a score. You choose 1 to 10, choose whatever scale you like for each one of those characteristics. Just go through all the applications that are in your portfolio or that you're aware of, and just score them, rate them, and you'll come up with a total score. And of that total score, you can then categorize them into 2, 3, 4, however many tiers you want. And then once you've got the tiers, you can choose what testing to do and when to do it. And the second table here on the bottom is just an example of that. So a tier 1 critical application. In this example, we're going to require a source code analysis and require source code analysis anytime there's major code changes. Same thing with a dynamic analysis like a web vulnerability scan, but we're also going to require manual penetration testing to find things like business logic attacks and compound vulnerabilities that scanning tools just are not equipped to find. And we're also going to require threat modeling. Now, if you go down to tier 2 or to tier 3, we change some of those things to make the security requirements less abrasive, less stringent, and allow that development team to spend a little bit more time developing as opposed to going through security testing because of the criticality of the application. It's just not as severe. Okay. And I'm glad that, Holger, you asked this question in your survey. You asked organizations, how often do you test applications for threats and vulnerabilities? And as you can see, what is that, 30, 40, 42%, almost half, only test applications every 3 months or less frequently. And again, if that's what you want to do in your organization, that's fine. However, just keep in mind in between those tests, you're getting a lot of free penetration testing from the hacker community, even if you don't realize it. And then there are some organizations that test every time code changes, which is 19%. But you also see almost 20% of organizations that either never test or don't have any scheduled security testing. And again, that's a little bit disturbing, but hopefully what you've learned in the last few slides is that not all applications are built the same and they don't carry the same risk. So having a calibrated testing depth and frequency strategy for each application type or tier is the best practice that we're recommending here. All right, moving on. We've been talking about threat modeling, reducing attack surface, and risk rating applications. That's all sort of focused on testing, how to test, when to test, how deep to test. Now we're going to transition a little bit to talk about your staff. And the next best practice is training, and specifically role-based training. Again, leading with a question from the survey. Which inhibit your organizations from adequately defending against cyber threats? And the top 2, it was a tie, lack of skilled personnel and low security awareness amongst employees. Now, there were lots of other answers, lack of budget, lack of support from management, et cetera, but the top 2, lack of skilled personnel and low security awareness. Next question was asking about whether or not organizations have ample resources to fix vulnerabilities in a timely manner. And 53% reported that they don't. Excuse me. They either strongly disagree or disagree. More than half don't have ample resources. And that could be time, it could be budget, it could be staff to find and fix vulnerabilities. Too many organizations are relying on scanners. And again, not knocking scanners at all, but over-reliance on them is a very, very dangerous thing. And what they do is they scan. And not only can you open yourself up for missed security vulnerabilities, but every scanner that I've ever used, and all of us here at Security Innovation have used, they all produce some type of false positive, which means it will flag something as a vulnerability when it actually isn't. And that is, again, the definition of a time waste, because someone has to go through and validate and vet and curate those vulnerabilities. And if it's your development team, rest assured, they're going to be mighty unpleased chasing down reported security vulnerabilities that are not vulnerabilities, because it's impacting how they're measured, which is get those features out by this certain date and a certain time. And this find and fix hamster wheel, which is spinning constantly, is something that you want to break. You want to get off the hamster wheel. And the 3 previous best practices are great ways to do it. If you threat model, you reduce your attack surface, and you risk rate your applications, you'll know exactly where to spend your time with your limited staff and resources to get the most effective security assessment. Now, we also asked how organizations are currently training developers, and about 50% are using computer-based training, again, which is terrific. One thing that I was surprised to see is the 19% that reported interactive cyber ranges are being used. The reason that I was surprised to see this is not because cyber ranges are not useful. I think they're fantastic. And cyber ranges have become much more popular and in vogue over the past few years. However, the vast majority of cyber ranges that I've seen are network centric or infrastructure centric and not appropriate for developers. In fact, very few application security cyber ranges. But it is a fantastic way to reinforce training. In fact, the combination of computer-based training and an interactive cyber range, I always like to draw the analogy of it's similar to getting a golf lesson from a pro and then going to the driving range to practice. The driving range is the cyber range. The lesson from the pro is your computer-based training. But it is imperative to have that hands-on component. Adults learn best when they experience, when they're immersed, when they practice, when they do. So sitting in front of a computer and getting some training is great, but there's only a certain amount that's going to stick in your head until you, and humans will never own it until they can practice it. It's also why products like Rosetta Stone for learning a new language it combines also computer-based training with an interactive component where you have to practice. And that's a real key. When it comes to training, thinking role-based and technology and task-based is critically important. And the reason that I say this is because just like applications, not all development team members are created equal. They do different things. And even within the same job role, like a developer, you need different types of training. A Java developer needs different training than a .NET developer. And they need different training than someone that writes mobile applications to be deployed on iOS and Android. So you need to think role-based, and then you need to think which technologies and platforms and development languages are in place, because you want to provide training in the most highly contextual way. A generic secure coding training is fine from a foundational standpoint, but what you're trying to do there is change the behavior of a developer to think on a routine basis. Oh, I need to sanitize this user input. That's great. But then you need to train them on how to do it, not just what to do, but how to do it, and how to do it in their specific development language. Now, one way to get development teams, and using teams as opposed to just developer, to get teams interested in learning about cybersecurity and secure coding, is to tap into the cool factor of hacking. And this is particularly where cyber ranges can become very useful. Cyber ranges can be organized and structured in a game sort of setting or capture the flag type of event, where you can have development teams learning about security vulnerabilities in kind of a hack the app sort of way. And that's a great way for them to learn how applications get exploited and how they're vulnerable. And that is the first step for them to understand how to protect against those vulnerabilities. So if a developer is sitting there and they experience how a SQL injection attack is carried out, they can make that inferential leap, which is not a very difficult thing for them to do, to try to figure out how they would protect against that SQL injection attack. Is it sanitizing the input? Is it coding, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So from a, here's just a quick checklist. Again, just choosing 4 main roles in software development team. Could be a team lead, a program, a product manager, and then I chose architects, developers, and testers. Each one of these folks have a job to do. Testers think of test cases and use cases, and developers think about building functional code. Well, it's a very simple overlay to add security to that. So architects, they need to choose components, they need to select databases and frameworks, because that is the blueprint that they're handing over to developers to then go and implement. Well, just think about choosing secure components and databases and frameworks that have security controls or mechanisms built into them. And developers, instead of just thinking about good functional code, consider security as an aspect of software quality. Just because you have good functioning code and high performing code doesn't mean you have secure code. In fact, it often doesn't. So it's a pretty straightforward overlay. And then for testers, I think this is the easiest change to make, because testers, by their nature, break stuff. And instead of just, again, breaking functionality or breaking performance, think about security as an aspect of software quality. What would an abuse case be instead of a use case? Here's an example of role-based learning paths. And again, I just chose 6 different roles, 4 developers, 1 architect, and 1 tester. And I chose 4 developers specifically so you can see how each developer, even though they may have some things that are in common, like fundamentals of secure development, it's very important to get into their technology stacks with as much context as possible. Creating secure AJAX code for ASP.NET, creating secure jQuery code, creating secure code in Objective-C or Swift or Java for Android, etc. Is very important to have that not just role-based, but also technology-based learning path. All right. The 5th of 5 best practices is creating and then maintaining a secure and repeatable software development lifecycle. Again, referring back to the survey, what secure development initiatives do you currently deploy? 39, 35, and 35% put in some type of control, whether it's a security code review every time code is checked in, or a role-based education program, which is great for those 35% that said that, and then 35% some kind of process to track third-party or open source code, which is fantastic. That's great. 18% do nothing. And again, very disturbing. I applaud their honesty. But if you think about 1 out of every 5 organizations don't have any type of secure development lifecycle initiative, you can really understand why there are so many successful data breaches. And of those folks that do have some type of secure development process or tooling, the vast majority of them are relying on technology solutions or tools, whether it's a web application firewall, it's a vulnerability scanner, or anti-malware software. That's the majority of respondents. That's what they're doing. Of the manual techniques that were listed, as you can see, none of them scored even 40%. Secure code reviews, secure coding guidelines, developer training, threat modeling, none of them scored even 40%. The manual techniques, these are the ones that are going to give you the deepest type of assessment and deliver the best return on that investment when it comes to reduction of security vulnerabilities and up-leveling the skill set of your team. So even though manual techniques are not the most common, they are in fact the most valuable and return the best results. Vulnerability scanning, 69% of folks doing it. Vulnerability scanning, and again, I'm not knocking the scanning tools for the vendors, it can actually have the negative effect of slowing down your software development process because of all of those false positives that end up getting generated. And if you're scanning on a regular basis, you're going to overwhelm your defect management system and your development team with things that are literally time wasters and eventually will get tuned out. And we've seen that happen all too often. All right, I said I wouldn't knock the scanning vendors, but apparently I am. But I'm really not. Again, all I'm trying to do with this slide here is make sure you keep scanners in the box that they were designed for. They are designed to match patterns. They find common and known problems, and they do so faster than humans, which is great. That's why there's such a need for scanning. One of the biggest problems, however, is that you might run a scan, it will find security vulnerabilities that are legitimate, but your developers still don't know how to fix the vulnerabilities. That goes back to best practice number 4, which is role and technology-based training for your development teams. And keep in mind, 80% of software bugs or software defects are introduced in the requirements and design phase. This is something that was first documented by Steve McConnell in, I believe his book was called Code Complete. 80% of defects are introduced before a single line of code is even written. It's like having a flawed blueprint and then trying to build a house. It just isn't going to work, and software is no different. Penetration testing, the third bullet on here, it is a great way to verify security was implemented correctly. However, most organizations use it as a software quality measure. It's not an activity in which you should be finding the majority of the problems. Penetration testing should be a validation step that you've done things properly. And it might sound like a subtle difference, but it's a very important difference to think about. I mentioned the overlay of security on top of core software development lifecycle activities. And here, typical software development lifecycle, you define things, you design things, you code things, you test things, you deploy things, and then you maintain them. And at each one of these phases, there is a logical security overlay that can just be added to what the development team is doing during development or test or even deployment. Microsoft, they did this a number of years ago, but it's fantastic data. What they did is they put their Windows team and their SQL Server team through training, and they measured number of vulnerabilities before and after the training. They then went and calculated how much each vulnerability cost Microsoft in terms of developer time to fix, to patch, updating customers, etc. So they got a true ROI. It's the only study of its kind that I've seen so far. But just looking at the simplest data point, the simplest metric, they were able to see a reduction of vulnerabilities from 45% to 91% after putting folks through secure development lifecycle training. And what that reduction of vulnerabilities means is more time for the developers to actually be writing the functional code, the performance code, and actually accelerated their software development lifecycle. Imagine that, security accelerating a software development lifecycle. It's exactly what Microsoft did. And I've got just one or two more slides before I turn things back over to you, Holger, and maybe open it up for some questions. I do want to let folks know how security innovation has helped clients over our 15 years and how hopefully we can help you if you need some assistance. I've talked about education and assessment a lot in this presentation, and those are two cores or two pillars of our solution set. And we do provide very robust application security training solutions, both in terms of computer-based training in the cyber range, and we do a tremendous amount of security assessments, whether it's application penetration testing, code review, design review, threat modeling, et cetera, et cetera. Just an example of a cyber range. We have 7 different application security cyber ranges, in fact, and this is the whole concept of learning by doing. So I won't spend much time on this. At the end of this webinar, as Holger mentioned, the slides will be made available, the replay will be made available. However, you could also get the complete application security report from Cybersecurity Insiders, which is chock full of fantastic data from that survey of nearly 500 organizations. I only touched upon a handful of the data from the research report. If you'd like a copy of this, feel free to contact me directly. My email address is on the screen. You can send an email to getsecure@securityinnovation.com. You can tweet me at AppSec. Yes, I did get that Twitter handle, which means I'm old and I've been at this for a while. But with that, let me turn things over to you, Holger, and see where we stand in terms of questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Ed. The first question, how do you know when you've considered, all threats?
Well, you probably never will. But my advice here is just don't overcomplicate things. The whole purpose of threat modeling is to make your life easier and not harder. So don't overcomplicate it. Start from the most obvious and or most damaging threats that are going to compromise your key assets. And also keep in mind, there's no right or wrong way to threat model. You can, as I mentioned, you can use a whiteboard. You can download Microsoft's tool from their SDL site. I even think Microsoft still has a card game available, so you literally can get a development team in a room and play a game of cards. It's called Escalation of Privilege or something like that. It's a threat modeling card game. There's no right or wrong way to do it. The keys really is focusing on the assets that you're trying to protect, and imagine how an attacker will try to get at them. And once you do those two activities, putting mitigating controls in place for each one of them, it becomes an interactive and actually kind of a fun exercise. But remember to update your threat models as new threats emerge as well. That's one thing that folks need to remember. If you do threat modeling on an application and you actually have a threat model, you might document it in a flow chart or a diagram or something like that. When a new threat emerges, something like Heartbleed, for example, take a look at your threat model and determine, oh, am I susceptible to this new threat? And oftentimes you'll be able to determine very quickly yes or no. And if the answer is no, great. If the answer is yes, go right back into threat modeling. What mitigating control would I put in place to protect against this threat?
Excellent, very good. I think we have time for one more question. Okay. And the question is, generally speaking, which application platforms do you feel carry the most inherent risk from a technology or deployment perspective?
Oh, right. Well, that's an easy one for me. If I look at all the different types of software applications, whether it's web or mobile or cloud or IoT, IoT sticks out to me head and shoulders above all the rest as the most troublesome. And partly because a lot of the manufacturers of IoT devices have moved from a world of purely, hardware to one where, software is now managing their hardware and controlling it, and they're opening up previously closed devices that didn't have IP addresses or communication protocols that went over the internet, and now they do. And a lot of times they just don't have the right staff, so they end up writing these software programs for the IoT devices, and they don't know how to secure them. And this is exactly the problem that Dyn experienced with their distributed denial of service attack a couple of years ago. And millions of IoT devices were compromised because they didn't have any security measures in place, or they just had default usernames and passwords that were easily discoverable. So that's an easy one for me, Holger. IoT all the way.
Excellent. Now, as we're closing this webinar, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Ed, many thanks to you for sharing your insights on application security and how to reduce enterprise risk. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Holger, and thank you all for listening.
Excellent. This concludes today's session. I hope we will see all of you again at one of our future webinars. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.